Autumn in Greenwood Cemetery wasn't just a season, it was a state of being. The ancient oaks, once dressed in gold and crimson, now stood bare, their gnarled branches reaching toward the moon like skeletal fingers. The wind didn't whistle through them. It breathed, carrying the weight of countless buried secrets. And Tom Whitaker, the night watchman of this kingdom of stone and shadow, walked alone among the dead like a shepherd tending his eternally sleeping flock. Tom wasn't an easily spooked man. 20 years among headstones and mausoleums had taught him that real terrors didn't come from ghosts, but from the living, from grave robbers, from drunk kids hopping the gates, from lovers seeking privacy among the monuments. But tonight the air felt different. The other workers always whispered about the man in the hat. "He appears near the Blackwell Mausoleum," old Henderson from maintenance would say, sharpening his tools. "Only after midnight. Just standing there, watching. And if you get too close, poof, gone." "Bullshit," Tom would grumble, lighting another cigarette. "Just stories to scare the new guys." Yet now, as he walked the dirt path winding through the oldest section, Tom felt a cold that had nothing to do with the wind. It was a deep cold, rising up through his boots like the ground itself was sucking the warmth from his bones. He stopped dead, rubbing his arms. That's when he heard it. A whisper. Not from behind a tree. Not from any particular grave. It seemed to come from the air itself, like the night was speaking. Tom spun around, flashlight raised, his pulse pounding so loud he could hear it in his ears. Nothing. Just the mist dancing between headstones. "Imagination," he muttered to himself, forcing his feet to move. The whispers came again. Clearer this time. "Elias." Tom froze. His grip on the flashlight turned his knuckles white. Who the hell was Elias? Determined to prove his mind was playing tricks, he marched to the records office, a moldy wooden shed near the back gates. Inside, he tore through dusty ledgers, burial records, old maps, anything that might explain the name the night kept whispering. And then he found it. A yellowed page, brittle with age, dated October 15, 1872. The ink was faded but legible. Elias Vorth, gravedigger, disappeared this night. Last seen near Blackwell Mausoleum. Wore dark clothing and a wide-brimmed hat. Search conducted. No trace. Case closed. Tom's throat went dry. Wide-brimmed hat. Before he could process this, a crash shattered the silence. The iron gate to the old section, heavy and rusted, slammed shut with unnatural force. Tom's flashlight flickered, the beam dying like a candle in the wind. And then he saw it. Between the graves, a tall, thin figure stood as if planted there centuries ago. Its clothes were black and old-fashioned. Its face, if it had a face, was pale and smooth as polished marble. But what made Tom's blood turn to ice was the hat. A wide-brimmed hat, blacker than a moonless night. Then, as if pushed by a wind that didn't exist, the hat fell to the ground, empty. When Tom looked back at the figure, it was gone. 3 nights had passed since the incident at the Blackwell Mausoleum, but for Tom Whitaker, each hour dragged like a year. Sleep, once his refuge, had become a sentence. The dreams always started the same way. He'd be standing in the cemetery, wrapped in fog so thick it sucked all color from the world, leaving only shades of charcoal and ash. Endless rows of tilted headstones stretched before him like rotten teeth in a gaping jaw. And there, just at the edge of his vision, the silhouette, the man in the hat, motionless between 2 ancient oaks, his black coat merging with the shadows, only the pale outline of his face visible under that wide brim. Never approaching, never retreating, just watching like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. Tom always woke at the same moment, when the man raised his hand in what might have been a greeting or a summons. His awakenings were violent, his body drenched in cold sweat, muscles taut like violin strings about to snap. On the fourth night, too exhausted to fight it anymore, Tom decided to confront the mystery. Armed with his flashlight and a half-empty bottle of whiskey, his liquid courage, as he joked to himself, he headed for the cemetery's oldest section. The full moon hung heavy overhead, casting elongated shadows that slithered across the ground like living things. That's when he saw it, the figure, not in his dream, but right there, in the flesh, if flesh was even the right word. Standing before the Vorth family mausoleum, a Gothic monument of black granite adorned with tormented angels. The man, if man it was, stood with his back turned, his hat a black smudge against darker stone. Tom froze. The whiskey burned in his gut, but did nothing to dull the primal fear crawling up his spine. Who's there? His voice came out thin, choked. No answer. He took one step, then another. Each footfall made the gravel crunch like bones being ground to dust. When he was just a few yards away, his flashlight flickered, and the figure vanished. Not like someone running or hiding, like smoke dissipating in the wind. On the ground where it had stood, a single object remained. The hat, black as pitch, dusty as if abandoned decades ago. Tom knelt, his hand hovering over it. Part of him screamed to run, to never look back. But something darker, something hungry, made him reach out. The leather was ice cold. Not autumn chill, but grave cold, the kind that seeps up from 6 feet under. When his fingers closed around the brim, it felt like an electric current shot up his arm. "You've been here a long time already." The voice didn't come from outside, didn't come from within. It was planted in his mind like a memory that wasn't his. Tom dropped the hat with a strangled cry, falling backward onto the dirt. His heart hammered against his ribs, his vision swimming for one terrifying moment. When his eyes refocused, the hat was gone. But something new had appeared. On the Vorth mausoleum's marble face, where only moss and the names of the dead had been before, fresh engraving gleamed in the moonlight, as if carved that very night. Tom Whitaker, Night Watchman, 1872 to 1872. His own name, and a death date that had passed, over a century ago. The air in the records room felt thicker since last night. Tom Whitaker smelled mold and old ink on his clothes, but something else too, the metallic tang of wet earth, like the walls themselves were sweating grave dirt. He hadn't slept. How could he, after what he'd seen? His name, carved into the Vorth mausoleum, dated 1872. His hands shook as he flipped through the ancient ledgers, page after page of faded handwriting. The lantern on the desk cast shadows that danced like playful spirits across the walls, but he barely noticed them anymore. Something real was happening. Something beyond logic. Elias Vorth. Elias Vorth. He muttered, fingers skimming burial logs, payroll records, gravediggers' diaries. Then he found it. A smaller book bound in cracked black leather, hidden behind a stack of archived maps. No title on the cover, just a faded symbol that looked like a hand with splayed fingers, reaching. When he opened it, a cloud of dust made him cough. The first page was stained with something dark, ink, blood, and bore a single sentence. The night watchman never leaves his post. He only changes places. Tom's spine tingled. He turned the page carefully, half expecting the book to bite his fingers. And then he saw him. A faded photograph glued to the upper corner. A group portrait of stern-faced men in 19th century attire. And in the center, one man taller than the rest, with a gaunt face and eyes sunk deep in shadow, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. Elias Vorth. Tom didn't know how, but he knew. The same man he'd seen among the graves. The one now visiting his dreams. His eyes dropped to the text below, written in cramped, tiny script. October 15th, 1872. Tonight I complete the ritual. When the moon is full again, I'll take my place among the keepers. The next watchman is already chosen. He won't understand until it's too late. Until the hat is on his head. A sudden noise outside made Tom slam the book shut. Something, or someone, was scratching at the wooden door. Not random scratches, but patterns, like someone trying to carve a message into the wood. Tom sat paralyzed, eyes locked on the door. The room had dropped several degrees in seconds. His breath fogged before his face, though it wasn't nearly cold enough for that. The scratching continued, each mark louder than the last. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Tom counted to 10 in his head before approaching the door, each step making the floorboards groan like dying men. When he finally dared to peer through the keyhole, he saw only darkness. An eye. Huge, bloodshot, its iris a milky gray, filled his entire view. Tom fell back with a shout, knocking over the chair and lantern. The light went out, plunging the room into perfect darkness. And in that darkness, something began to laugh. A low, wheezing chuckle that came not from the door, nor from outside, but from inside the room. Worse, it came from exactly where Tom had left the book lying open. The darkness in the records room was absolute. Tom squeezed his eyes shut so hard he saw stars, but when he opened them again, the blackness remained unbroken. That laughter kept circling him, changing pitch like a cursed wind whistling around a mausoleum. Who's there? His voice came out strangled, the words sticking to his dry throat. The laughter stopped dead. The silence that followed was so thick Tom could hear his own blood pounding in his ears. Then, slow as a coffin being dragged over gravel, a new sound cut through. Flip. The unmistakable sound of a page turning. Flip. Another. Tom reached blindly forward, hands finding the table, then the fallen flashlight. When he clicked it, only a dry snick answered. The batteries were dead. Flip. Another page. Closer now. This isn't real, Tom whispered to himself, teeth chattering. Just exhaustion, just. Flip. Right by his feet now. Tom scrambled back until his spine hit the wall. That wet earth smell intensified, mixing with something worse, the cloying sweetness of rotting meat. Then, like an invisible curtain had been drawn, a shaft of moonlight pierced the records room's grimy window. Not normal silver moonlight, but a sickly green glow that seemed to come from the cemetery itself. In that unnatural light, Tom saw. The book lay open on the floor, its yellowed pages fluttering as if in a breeze, though the air stood still as a fresh grave. And hunched over it, a gaunt figure in an antique frock coat. The man didn't look up when the light hit him, but Tom saw the hands, too long, too pale, with nails that curved like claws. Those skeletal fingers traced the pages with priestly reverence. Flip. The pages stopped. The figure froze. Then, for the first time, the man in the hat lifted his face. Tom's throat clenched. Where there should have been a face was just smooth, pallid skin, no eyes, no mouth, just blankness. Yet Tom felt the weight of a gaze from that void, probing his soul like a cold finger poking his brain. The creature pointed at the open page. Tom didn't want to look, didn't want to move, but his feet carried him forward like a sleepwalker. When he finally looked down, his gut twisted. It was a list. Names. Hundreds of them in different handwritings, some so old the ink had nearly faded. But 3 near the bottom jumped out at him. Elias Vorth, 1845 to 1872. James Holloway, 1872 to 1901. Richard Morn, 1901 to 1930. And below, in a blank space that seemed left there on purpose, an antique pen rested beside a small inkwell that still looked wet. Tom understood before the man in the hat even moved. Before those bone hands extended the black hat toward him. Before the voiceless voice echoed inside his skull. Sign your name, Tom Whitaker. Sign and become one of us. His fingers trembled over the pen. Some distant part of his mind screamed to run, to smash the window, to never look back. But another part whispered that he'd always known this truth. Known it since his first night at Greenwood. Since the first dream. Since before he was born. His hand moved on its own, dipping the pen. The ink was red, thick, and when the first drop hit the page, Tom swore he heard, somewhere deep in the cemetery, the sound of a shovel biting into fresh earth, ready for its new occupant. The quill shook between Tom's fingers, its scarlet tip hovering over the yellowed parchment. Each heartbeat thundered in his ears like a funeral drum. The red ink, so red, so alive, formed a fat droplet at the nib, ready to fall onto the line where his name would be etched forever. The air in the records room had turned thick as molasses. Tom felt it in his lungs, heavy and damp, saturated with the smell of turned earth and dead flowers. The man in the hat stood motionless, his silhouette warping like melting wax in the greenish light from the window. Sign, the not voice spoke again, no longer a whisper but a command that vibrated in his bones. And the suffering ends. The ink drop fell. When it hit the parchment, Tom heard a sound that didn't belong to this world, the distant screech of rusted hinges, like a coffin opening deep underground. The ink spread, forming letters he didn't need to write. Tom Whitaker, 1930-_. The death year remained incomplete. The man in the hat extended a skeletal hand, offering the black hat like some sacred relic. Tom felt an icy numbness crawling up his legs, as if roots of frost were growing from his feet, anchoring him to the spot. I don't want this, Tom managed, though each word cut his throat like broken glass. The void where the man in the hat's face should be stretched into something that might have been a smile. When it spoke again, the voice came not from Tom's mind, but from every corner of the room at once, like 100 mouths whispering in unison. But you already accepted, Tom. The first night you stepped foot in Greenwood. When you breathed our air, walked our soil. You're already one of us. You just don't know it yet. The hat in the specter's hand began to change. The aged leather seemed to melt like wax, becoming something that pulsed and breathed, a living black mass writhing like a freshly harvested heart. Tom felt his own chest throbbing in sync, a sharp pain stabbing through him as if invisible knives were carving his name not just on paper, but into his very flesh. The quill clattered from his fingers. The man in the hat, or what lurked beneath that hat, leaned closer. Put it on, Tom Whitaker. Wear it and understand your true purpose. The ground beneath Tom's feet felt warm now, pulsing like living flesh. When the hat touched his hair, something inside him ruptured. Not pain, but memory. Memories that weren't his. Men weeping in records rooms. Men running between graves, chased by shadows wearing their own faces. Men aging decades in a single night, hair falling out, skin wrinkling, until only bones and a black hat remained. And then, the most terrible truth. Greenwood wasn't a cemetery. It was a predator. And the night watchmen were its favorite prey. Tom screamed as the hat settled onto his head, but the sound was swallowed by a chorus of voices rising from every grave, every mausoleum, every inch of soil. The walls of the records room dissolved like smoke, revealing Greenwood transformed, the trees now black and twisted, the headstones glowing with bioluminescent moss, the very air vibrating with ancient power. And standing at the center of it all, 100 figures in black hats turned toward him in unison. The man in the hat's final words slithered into Tom's ear as the world faded to black. Welcome home, Watchman. When Tom came to, dawn was breaking. He lay on the cold ground near the Blackwell mausoleum, his body aching as if he'd been buried and dug up again. And on his head, weighing more than any crown, sat the black wide-brimmed hat. It didn't just fit. It belonged. The morning sun stained the tombstones amber as Tom Whitaker, or what was left of him, entered the abandoned chapel at Greenwood's heart. His footsteps made no sound. His boots stirred no dust. The black hat, now fused to his very being, weighed on his skull like a crown of lead. Inside the chapel, light through grime-caked stained glass painted bloodshot patterns on the stone floor. At the center stood a figure waiting, not the man in the hat Tom knew, but another, older one, his frock coat as faded as 18th-century headstones. "You're late for the oath," the creature said without moving its lips. Its voice was the sound of dead leaves scraping over marble. Tom tried to speak, but his throat produced only a rasp, like dirt being shoveled onto pine wood. His hands, now pale and translucent, shook before his eyes. The Ancient One raised a skeletal arm. From the chapel's shadows, other men, if they could be called men, emerged. All wore black hats. All had eyes that reflected the void between stars. "The first shift is always the hardest," whispered a woman whose hat seemed grafted to her skull, her skin veined with black roots that pulsed beneath the surface. "You still remember the smell of bread, the warmth of sunlight." Tom collapsed to his knees. His ribs ached as if something inside were rearranging. When he coughed, tiny black insects escaped his mouth, dissolving like smoke. The Ancient One placed a hand, cold as a winter headstone, on his shoulder. "Come. There's a burial at moonrise. You must learn to lead the procession." Outside, the cemetery had transformed. Unfamiliar graves rose between the trees, their inscriptions in dead languages. Floating candles drifted along the paths, their flames casting light that didn't illuminate, but consumed shadows. And at the center of the main path waited a black hearse, drawn not by horses but by figures, creatures with too many joints, their faces frozen masks of eternal terror. They were watchmen who failed their duties, the Ancient One explained as Tom climbed aboard. Now they serve as warnings. Inside the hearse, the air reeked of rotting lilies in stagnant water. The seats, upholstered in leather Tom didn't want to examine too closely, groaned under his weight. The Ancient One produced a cloudy glass bottle. "Drink. It helps with the change." The liquid inside moved on its own, black and thick as crude oil. When Tom drank, the taste exploded in his mouth. All the tears ever shed in Greenwood, all the dying breaths, all the secrets taken to the grave. As the hearse began moving, Tom looked through the fogged window and saw the cemetery bending. Trees leaned at impossible angles. Graves spun like tops. The sky had become a whirlpool of falling stars that never landed. "Where?" Tom's question died as the Ancient One smiled, a horrifying stretch of skin revealing teeth like rice grains. "To the nameless burial. The one that happens in every time and none. The one you'll lead forevermore, Tom Whitaker." Through the mist, Tom saw them, hundreds of black-clad figures with faces that shouldn't exist, marching toward a grave pulsing with violet light. Inside that grave, something breathed. And waited. The black hearse stopped before the Blackwell mausoleum, its wheels sinking slightly into the earth as if the ground remembered them. Tom stepped out, his feet leaving faint impressions, not like a man walks, but like a shadow might dent grass. The hat on his head throbbed in time with Greenwood's own rhythm, as if the entire cemetery were one enormous black heart buried beneath the soil. The Ancient One pointed with a finger that stretched too far. "There. The procession has begun." Between the oldest graves, where the mists never fully dissipated, shapes moved. Not mourners. Not ghosts. Memories, the cemetery's own recollections, dressed in tattered remnants of past lives, dragging feet that never quite touched earth. Each carried an object, a rusted shovel, an extinguished lantern, a pocket watch frozen at its owner's death moment. Tom felt his body, if he could still call it that, move without his command toward the group. His footsteps synchronized perfectly with a sound from below. Slow, subterranean knocking, like something massive breathing in forgotten catacombs. When he joined the procession, the faces turned toward him. Or rather, the emptiness where faces should be. Tom realized each figure wore a variation of the black hat, some wider brimmed, some oddly creased, all bearing marks of time in ways that defied logic. A child-sized thing clutched a toy, a wooden horse whose eyes tracked Tom. As he passed, the toy's head rotated with a dry creak and whispered, "He's waiting in the ossuary." The procession advanced toward Greenwood's most ancient section, where names on headstones had been worn to nothing. Here, the air hung heavier, thick with the scent of century-old extinguished candles. The trees grew twisted, their bark scarred with patterns resembling screaming faces. And there, at the center of a ring of uneven graves, stood him, the original man in the hat. But now, hatless, his hat being on Tom's head, his true form was revealed. Hair made of thin roots burrowed into his scalp, connecting him directly to the soil. His eyes were two voids reflecting not light, but the spaces between graves. "Welcome to your first burial of the forgotten." His voice came not as sound, but as the rustle of dead leaves in wind. Tonight we enter what remains of Thomas P. Greeley, night watchman from 1832 to 1845. Tom looked at the open grave. It exhaled greenish mist. But what made him recoil was the coffin, not wood, but hundreds of intertwined black hats, shifting like a single living organism. The Ancient One handed him a shovel forged from what looked like fused bones. "As the new keeper, you must complete the ritual. Dig your first grave." When Tom gripped the shovel, a shock ran up his arm. Suddenly he saw Thomas P. Greeley in life, a hearty man who whistled while working. His discovery of the Book of Names. The moment he'd put on the hat. And worst of all, Greeley's rebellion, his attempted escape. The visions changed. Now Tom saw Greeley being unmade, his body becoming one with the cemetery, his consciousness woven into tree roots, his voice added to the nightly whispers. The shovel trembled in Tom's hands. The man in the hat, or what remained beneath hats, leaned close. "Dig, Tom Whitaker. Dig and understand your true purpose." The earth underfoot felt warm, pulsing like living flesh. When the shovel bit into soil, something dark and thick oozed up. Not blood, but something older. The liquid formed patterns resembling names, dates, epitaphs. And then, from the grave's depths, a hand emerged. Not skeletal, but covered in damp, pale skin, fingers ending in blackened nails like old roots. It seized Tom's wrist and pulled. The black hearse stopped before the Blackwell Mausoleum, its wheels sinking slightly into the earth as if the ground remembered them. Tom stepped out, his feet leaving faint impressions, not like a man walks, but like a shadow might dent grass. The hat on his head throbbed in time with Greenwood's own rhythm, as if the entire cemetery were one enormous black heart buried beneath the soil. The Ancient One pointed with a finger that stretched too far. "There. The procession has begun." Between the oldest graves, where the mists never fully dissipated, shapes moved. Not mourners. Not ghosts. Memories, the cemetery's own recollections, dressed in tattered remnants of past lives, dragging feet that never quite touched earth. Each carried an object, a rusted shovel, an extinguished lantern, a pocket watch frozen at its owner's death moment. Tom felt his body, if he could still call it that, move without his command toward the group. His footsteps synchronized perfectly with a sound from below. Slow, subterranean knocking, like something massive breathing in forgotten catacombs. When he joined the procession, the faces turned toward him. Or rather, the emptiness where faces should be. Tom realized each figure wore a variation of the black hat, some wider brimmed, some oddly creased, all bearing marks of time in ways that defied logic. A child-sized thing clutched a toy, a wooden horse whose eyes tracked Tom. As he passed, the toy's head rotated with a dry creak and whispered, "He's waiting in the ossuary." The procession advanced toward Greenwood's most ancient section, where names on headstones had been worn to nothing. Here, the air hung heavier, thick with the scent of century-old extinguished candles. The trees grew twisted, their bark scarred with patterns resembling screaming faces. And there, at the center of a ring of uneven graves, stood him, the original man in the hat. But now, hatless, his hat being on Tom's head, his true form was revealed. Hair made of thin roots burrowed into his scalp, connecting him directly to the soil. His eyes were two voids reflecting not light, but the spaces between graves. "Welcome to your first burial of the forgotten." His voice came not as sound, but as the rustle of dead leaves in wind. "Tonight we enter what remains of Thomas P. Greeley, night watchman from 1832 to 1845. Tom looked at the open grave. It exhaled greenish mist. But what made him recoil was the coffin, not wood, but hundreds of intertwined black hats, shifting like a single living organism. The Ancient One handed him a shovel forged from what looked like fused bones. "As the new keeper, you must complete the ritual. Dig your first grave." When Tom gripped the shovel, a shock ran up his arm. Suddenly he saw Thomas P. Greeley in life, a hearty man who whistled while working. His discovery of the Book of Names. The moment he'd put on the hat. And worst of all, Greeley's rebellion, his attempted escape. The visions changed. Now Tom saw Greeley being unmade, his body becoming one with the cemetery, his consciousness woven into tree roots, his voice added to the nightly whispers. The shovel trembled in Tom's hands. The man in the hat, or what remained beneath hats, leaned close. "Dig, Tom Whitaker. Dig and understand your true purpose." The earth underfoot felt warm, pulsing like living flesh. When the shovel bit into soil, something dark and thick oozed up. Not blood, but something older. The liquid formed patterns resembling names, dates, epitaphs. And then, from the grave's depths, a hand emerged. Not skeletal, but covered in damp, pale skin, fingers ending in blackened nails like old roots. It seized Tom's wrist. And pulled. The skeletal hand clamped Tom's wrist with vice-like strength, its black nails sinking into flesh that no longer bled but oozed an amber vapor. The ground around the grave began to move, undulating like water disturbed by something rising from unfathomable depths. Tom screamed, but the sound was swallowed by a sudden wind howling through the headstones, a wind carrying whispering voices that chanted in unison. "Every grave dug is a name forgotten. Every grave dug is a name forgotten." The man in the hat watched, motionless, his smooth face reflecting the sickly moonlight as tree roots twisted like starving serpents toward Tom. "Don't fight it," the Ancient One's voice echoed from the earth itself. "This is how we feed, how Greenwood lives." The hand yanked violently, and Tom fell to his knees at the grave's edge. The black liquid oozing from the soil now formed letters, words, an epitaph that kept rearranging itself. "Here lies Thomas P. Greeley, night watchman, 1832 to 1845, and all who came after." Then Tom saw. The grave didn't hold one body. It held bodies, piled, intertwined, their rotting clothes still sporting the same black hats, their skeletons fused with root systems that pierced them like needles through cloth. Some retained patches of mummified flesh, others were bare bone sculpted by time. But they all shared one grotesque feature. Their skulls were blooming. From eye sockets, from gaping jaws, sprouted black flowers with thick, moist petals that pulsed like tiny hearts. "We are Greenwood," the man in the hat's voice vibrated through Tom's bones as the hand dragged him closer. "Our flesh feeds its trees. Our voices are its wind. Our fears are its shadows." Something tore inside Tom when his leg touched the grave's black ooze. Not pain, memory. Memories not his own. Men weeping in record rooms. Men sprinting between headstones, chased by shadows wearing their faces. Men aging decades in a single night until only bones and a black hat remained. And the most terrible truth: Greenwood wasn't a cemetery. It was a predator. And night watchmen were its favorite prey. Tom screamed as the hand pulled him over the edge, his body tipping into the mass of corpses and pulsating flowers. But before he fell, the impossible happened. The hat on his head tightened like a constricting snake. And a new voice, not the man in the hats, not the ancient ones, whispered directly into his mind. "What if I told you there's a way out? That one watchman escaped before." The cemetery's response was instantaneous. Ancient oaks bent like struck by a hurricane. Weather-worn headstones split down the middle. And deep in the grave, something woke up. The darkness in Blackwell Mausoleum's undercroft smelled of spoiled rain and burnt bones. Tom gasped as he saw his doppelganger rise slowly, the rusted shovel glinting under the blood-red moon. The other Tom's fingers ended in the same blackened root-like nails as the man in the hats. "You shouldn't have come," the doppelganger whispered, its voice a distorted echo of Tom's own. "Now he'll take us both." Behind Tom, the rift in reality expanded, exhaling icy wind thick with the whispers of every soul Greenwood had ever consumed. The stench of freshly turned earth became so potent his eyes watered. "Who are you?" Tom choked out, backing toward the eastern mausoleum. The other Tom laughed, a sound that became a wet cough, spitting tiny black insects. "I'm what you'll become. What we all become." It pointed the shovel at the mausoleum. He tried to escape too. Look what happened. Tom turned. The eastern mausoleum wasn't like the others. Its walls were covered with hats. Hundreds of black wide-brimmed hats, some ancient and dust-caked, others still damp with sweat. Mounted like trophies. Above the door, a single inscription. "Here lie the keepers." The other Tom shuffled closer, feet dragging as if weighed by invisible chains. "Every time one of us tries to leave, Greenwood grows a new tomb." It raised its left hand, revealing fingers slowly fusing into black roots. "I tried breaking the cycle. It gave me this." A thunderous crack split the air. The rift now stretched 10 feet tall, and through it, Tom saw the man in the hat emerging, his body elongating like taffy, his blank face reflecting the hellish moonlight. "He's coming," the doppelganger whispered, eyes widening with primordial terror. "This time he won't just bury us. He'll unmake us." Tom looked at the diary in his hands. The final pages now bore a message that hadn't been there before, scrawled in frantic handwriting. "The first watchman's lantern still burns. Burn the hat. Break the cycle." The other Tom grabbed his arm, root fingers burning like dry ice. "No time. He's already." The warning came too late. A hand cold as deepest winter clamped Tom's shoulder. The stench of wet soil and rotting flowers filled his nostrils. Then a voice he knew intimately whispered in his ear, as familiar as his own blood. "Come home, Tom." When Tom turned, he stared into what had always been beneath the man in the hat's brim, and finally understood. The skeletal hand's grip burned like dry ice, its blackened nails sinking into Tom's wrist as the grave's edges pulsed like living flesh. The cemetery held its breath, the whispering oak stilled, the ever-present mist freezing mid-drift. Then the ground moved. Not an earthquake. Something worse. The dirt walls of the open grave began to peel back like flower petals at dawn, revealing wet strata of soil no shovel had ever touched. Layers of time unfolded. 1930s newsprint disintegrating into ink. 1890s funeral ribbons still blood-red. 1840s coffin nails arranged in strange patterns. And beneath it all, cradled in the roots of an ancient elm, lay the impossible tombstone, no larger than a prayer book, its surface polished like a funeral director's shoes. The inscription glowed with foxfire luminescence. Here rests the freedom of Elias Vorth. Claimed October 15, 1872. Reclaimed by none. Tom's doppelganger let out a wet chuckle that sprayed black spores. That's your way out. A child's headstone. The man in the hat's approach made reality warp, his elongated shadow swallowing the moonlight, his hatless head revealing the terrible truth Tom now understood. Every watchman who ever served Greenwood was him. All iterations. All eras. A single soul stretched across centuries like meat on a butcher's hook. As the man in the hat's root-like fingers closed around the tiny tombstone, the ground erupted. Dozens of skeletal hands burst forth, not to grab Tom, but to shield him. Their finger bones interlocked into a cage just as the man in the hat screamed, a sound that cracked nearby headstones and sent crows exploding from the treetops in gory bursts. The doppelganger yanked Tom backward. "Run, you idiot! That won't hold him!" But Tom was transfixed by the skeletal hands now crumbling to dust. Their final act hadn't been protection. They'd given him something. A single rusted key, warm as fresh blood. And etched into its bow, 2 words. "Light it." The key burned Tom's palm like sacramental wine on an open wound as he sprinted through Greenwood's nightmare geography. The cemetery had become a funhouse mirror of itself. Mausoleums breathing, willows weeping actual tears, shadows moving against the moonlight. His doppelganger's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "He's coming! Oh Christ, he's coming!" The Eastern Mausoleum's door loomed ahead, its wrought iron screaming in protest as Tom jammed the key into a lock that hadn't existed moments before. The mechanism turned with the sound of a dying man's last breath. Inside, the air smelled of burnt hair and forgotten birthdays. And there, hanging from a rusted hook, swayed the first watchman's lantern, its flame blue and impossibly steady despite having burned for a century. Tom didn't hesitate. He ripped the hat from his head, the pain like tearing off his own scalp. The moment the cursed thing left his body, the lantern flame leaped, not toward the hat, but behind Tom. The man in the hat stood framed in the doorway, his true form revealed at last. A writhing mass of roots and watchmen's uniforms, sprouting countless arms that ended in grasping hands. Where a face should be, there was only a pulsing black hole that sucked the light from the room. "You can't leave," the thing spoke with the voices of every watchman before Tom. "We're all Greenwood now." Tom threw the hat into the lantern's flame. The scream that followed wasn't sound. It was time unraveling. Headstones melted like wax. The mausoleum walls bled century-old blood. The man in the hat's form began to dissolve, but not before lunging forward with one final, desperate grab. His root-like fingers brushed Tom's cheek and turned to dust. Silence. And a bird sang. Tom stumbled outside to a sight that stopped his heart. Greenwood stood peaceful in dawn's light. Normal. Ordinary. Except for one detail. On a bench near the entrance sat a familiar black hat, neatly positioned as if waiting for its next owner. And beside it, a freshly dug grave with no headstone.